what's going on? It's Darryl Syms, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can play lead effectively over a blues progression. In fact, not even over a blues progression. We're going to be learning how to play with a blues progression, because a lot of people just play over, often the minor pentatonic scale, but we're going to learn how to complement the chords that you're playing over, as well as gain a greater understanding of the notes that you're playing. Throughout this lesson, there'll be diagrams on the screen, and if you want to download those as well as a transcript for this lesson, or you just want to support the work that I do, then check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. Alrighty, now what I'm going to try and highlight today is a very extensive topic, but I'm going to try and highlight the key things that are going to help you break out of that typical sort of pentatonic box shape when playing over a 12-bar blues progression. Now, I did a video last week on how to play blues rhythm effectively. I recommend that you check that out if you haven't already. And we're going to be using the same chord structure, which was A7, D7, and E7. We're going to be learning how to play lead over those chords. Now, what most people might do already is just grab the minor pentatonic scale and just whiz those notes over these chords, which does work, but eventually you get bored because these notes don't always complement each of the chords that you're playing over. So to complement the chords, you're going to need to understand the intervals that are within each chord. If you don't know much about intervals, then I recommend you check out my practical guitar theory course, which is linked in the description below, where you can learn about intervals and much more useful theory knowledge. Now, since these are all 7th chords, they all contain the same intervals, they're just in different parts of the neck. So starting with the A7, the key tones are 1, 5, flat 7, and 3. Now, what that means for us is those notes are great notes to choose when you're improvising over the top of that specific chord. So the simplest way to look at this so far is over the A7, the first chord, we can use our minor pentatonic scale and just add that major third there, since that note is in our A7 chord. So that's a real basic start, just including that major third over the 1 chord, which in this case is A7. Now, to advance on that, we need to find these key tones across the entire neck, ideally. And the best way to combat that is take the root note, in this instance the 5th fret on the E string, and we're going to arpeggiate the chord behind, in front, and on that root note. So what I mean by that is, if you're familiar with the cage system, we have a G shape where the intervals fall behind the root note, an E shape where the intervals kind of fall on the root note, and then a D shape where the intervals lead after that root note. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind if you want to expand your note range here. So the first arpeggio we're going to learn is the sort of G shape one, which is behind the root here, and it sounds like this. The next one falls on the root and it sounds like this. And the very last one falls after the root and it sounds like this. I encourage you to pause the video if you need to, because all of those notes are key tones within that first chord, which is A7. So any of those notes are going to be great notes to land on when you're playing that A7 chord shape. Essentially, those notes are going to complement the chord. To get familiar with that, what you can perhaps do is take an A7 chord. If you have a looper pedal, this would be handy right now. Play that A7. Just kind of loop it over and over and just play through some of those chord tones and kind of blend the shapes together if you can. So noodle around with them a little bit and get familiar. Now, if you're finding that too much to remember already, then just take one of these arpeggio shapes. So perhaps the sort of center one, the one that falls under the root, the E shape one that sounds like this. And you could use that one as well as the minor pentatonic scale to complement the chord tones of the chord that you're playing over. Now, when the chord changes, those A7 chord tones obviously aren't going to complement the next chord in the sequence, which is D7. So we're going to have to learn the chord tones that complement the D7 chord. Now, the good news here is essentially you move everything down a string, but the shapes change very slightly since we have one less string and we obviously have that B string to contend with. So check this out. Let's start off with the arpeggio shape that falls behind the root note, which is the 5th on the A string here. It sounds like this. And now the shape that falls on the root note. And lastly, the shape that falls after the root note. So once again, try and get familiar with that and blend the shapes together if you can. Get really comfortable finding those intervals, and you'll be glad to know that these are all the shapes that you need to know, despite there being another chord. But since the root note just goes up 2 frets, all of these patterns also go up 2 frets. So real quick, we would have So a good thing to try is, as the chord changes, so for example from the 1 to the 4 chord, highlight a key tone in the 4 chord. So let's give it a go. So notice that I went from that 1 chord and I descended to the 3rd of the D7. And then if I were to continue on, I would use notes from the minor pentatonic scale and that arpeggio there, so I would include that 3rd degree. The flat 7 is already in that A minor pentatonic shape, as is the 5. So this one's the only one that needs adding to that minor pentatonic shape. So if we play around with that, so you can see that that one note really changes the tonality of the scale. It really highlights the chord behind it without even having to play the chord. Now your next challenge is to improvise with these notes over a 12-bar feel without a backing track. So let me demonstrate that now. I'm going to strictly improvise with single notes from those arpeggio shapes, and you should still be able to hear the chords behind what I'm playing without them even being played. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me just play and you listen. In the following diagram, the yellow interval represents the first interval I play for each bar, and the pink interval represents my target note for the next bar. Watch closely and try to follow the diagram changes, and do play this back slowly or pause if you need to. So as you can see on screen, I was thinking ahead about what note is going to complement the next chord in the progression. So sometimes I might have highlighted the 3rd of the next chord or the root of the next chord as I went along. And that's really the key. You want to follow the chord progression with the chord tones, which essentially are all of the notes or any of the notes within those arpeggio shapes. So the best ones to aim for are definitely 3rds, roots, and flat 7ths. 5ths are the weakest chord tone. So now you know all of the correct notes to choose when improvising over a blues progression, but those aren't necessarily the best notes to choose, because if you choose the correct notes all the time, your music's going to be predictable and boring. So it's very important to add dissonance into your playing. And what that essentially means is that you need to use these correct notes as a guide only. So what I suggest you do is take the minor pentatonic scale and keep using it, but use these correct chord tones and just throw them in your improvisation as you go along. If I could give you a structure to learn this, I would definitely recommend number 1, exclusively use these arpeggio shapes. Make sure you're playing the correct notes all of the time throughout the entire sequence. And this is going to get you very familiar with those shapes. And I want you to also try and be aware of the tones that you're highlighting. Are you highlighting the 3rd, 5th, flat 7, root? That's for you to figure out. And then the next step on from that is blending these arpeggios with your minor pentatonic scale. And if you know both of these very confidently, you're going to have a lot more notes to choose from. And it's going to give you so much more options when improvising over a blues progression. Now, one more thing I want to try with you. If you look on screen, we have a blank canvas. If I add all of the notes from the A7, the D7, and the E7, you'll notice there are just 2 notes over the whole neck which aren't included in these arpeggio shapes. Those are the flat 2 and the sharp 5, also known as the minor 2nd and the minor 6. And those are notes that sound wrong over a blues progression. Those are notes that I don't recommend that you hang out on, but can be used as passing notes. And if you use those notes as passing notes, what's interesting here is that essentially you can play all 12 chromatic notes across the neck over a blues progression. But the main trick is not to play these notes in a completely random order. You need to be strategic about it and choose the right notes at the right time. I'm gonna do one more example for you now where I play the minor pentatonic scale and include some of these correct arpeggio notes among that. So check it out. So you could hopefully see in that example that I predominantly used the minor pentatonic shapes across the neck, but I would often bend some of those minor notes up into a major third, for example, as the chord changes. There we go, that's the end of the lesson. I hope you took something away from this video. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you would like to download the transcript and all the diagrams that I used throughout this video, then check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video.